Welcome to episode 2 of this special series here in Boston at Harvard Business School. And we are in for a treat. A friend of the show, a friend of mine, the king of the S-curve, Paul Nunes. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. It's great to be here in real life, as they say.
Brilliant to have you. And you can see Paul's body of work here. I haven't included mass affluence. That's because we're going to do an episode or two on that in the future. It's nearly 3 years, man, now since we covered your body of work. Yeah, it's been a while, and I was thinking about a couple of things. One is you studied S-curves. You've worked in them in application for over 30 years. But on top of that, you studied them before you even applied them. So you've done a huge body of work, and this includes in jumping the S-curve, but in practice, in different companies, seeing it in the field. You've talked about it since you're out of Accenture. There's a lot of knowledge there. And I wondered what has changed, because one of the things we kind of nerded out, we went for a coffee yesterday, we talked about this, was how there's a verticalization of the S-curve. So there's less and less time for adoption of a new technology, or there's less and less time to milk the cash cow if you're on that S-curve in the first place. There's a lot in there, but I'd love to talk about that and use it maybe as a spine of our conversation today.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And as we talked about, there's a lot of folks that understand the S-curve now and are sort of believing it. And we all kind of know that, there's a life cycle to every business. And then, over time, what we recognize is that technology has really accelerated that, which we understand that it would. And then, so out of jumping the S-curve where we said, how do you get to the next one? We recognized that technology was shrinking that and actually deforming the shape of the S-curve. So now we talk about the shark fin. And I know you love that. And we'll talk a bit more about the shark fin. But it's this idea that everything happens much faster and the nature of even innovation. There's no startup in the curve. There's no early adopters anymore. We can talk some more about that, but either it's right or it's not. So you have this big bang disruption and then it closes out. Now, what I've started to hear a lot more about lately is this idea that, maybe it's just going to become a continuous cycle. It's going to become, one moment in time that, what happens if it keeps shrinking? So I've given that and some of my colleagues. And of course, this is a team effort from a lot of great co-authors of mine, Larry Downs, Tim Breen. But the idea is, so what comes next? And does the S-curve ever really disappear when it becomes a completely vertical kind of curve? And what we've come to the realization is, and I think our point of view is it doesn't. It's not. It can't. People think, maybe we're going to get into this perpetual, and we joked about it even at coffee. It's like, if it ever becomes perfectly vertical, we're going to simply say, that was an idea. I wish I had got it out of the chair, right? Because you'll have the idea, but it's like, no, it's moments past. So it's like, all right, so it's going to be short, but it's not going to be instantaneous. And so then you're going to have to think about, what do you do when you have the idea? What do you do when you operationalize that and try and make it work, make it real? And then you're going to try and exploit that. And what do you have to do to that? And then you're going to have to get out of the business before you spend all the money pouring it back in, trying to innovate into the next thing. And so that's the fundamental point of the shark fin, of Big Bang disruption. Now, in Pivot to the Future, because, this is sort of the cycle, we realize, what real businesses have to do is manage really 3 or more S-curves at the same time, because you have to have the historical S-curve. You have your old, your now, and your new, and they feed each other. So that was the insight there, and that we looked again and again when we looked at successful businesses. And importantly, what happened is that the nature of CEOs had to be CEOs that managed simultaneous S-curves, simultaneous businesses, not just one. And so a good example there, we used Reed Hastings at Netflix. Netflix was DVDs for the longest time. I think now they still have $50 million in business in DVD distribution. But for the longest time, they maintained that along with their other ones, online distribution. And then, of course, using the insights from the data from online distribution to actually get into the content creation based on that. So you're running that together. But we think there's now actually a fourth element of what's happening to S-curves. And it's starting we left a little, I think I mentioned to you, is, an Easter egg in Big Bang Disruption, because we only mention it in the conclusion. But what happens when you can no longer play the entire curve and be an expert or deliver on the entire curve? What happens if you have to become a component of it? And that's something we talked a little bit about yesterday, and something I think we can talk a lot more about today.
So let's get some terminology so everybody's on the same page here. But you've given a big overview of there what we'll talk about. Let's build towards it. So the first is, let's tell our audience what the S-curve is, and maybe then the three hidden S-curves that exist inside the S-curve. So this is coming from jumping the S-curve.
So that's a great point. So let's start from the first principles. And actually, the first principle comes even before the S-curve in our research, which was the question of high performance. You remember that Accenture was high performance delivered. And so what Tim Breen, my co-author, and I really worked to do is to try and understand, what is business high performance? What is it you're trying to achieve? What's winning? And we have for decades had the argument about shareholder value, right? Is business all about shareholder value creation? And you can argue back and forth, but at some point there's got to be some element of profitability, and some element of renewal and continuation and survivorship. So when you look at that, then you say, okay, well, what does that look like in a real business? Well, it looks like the evolution of a product or service. It looks like we think of something people want, we test it, we work it, we start to sell it, they don't want it exactly, so they don't pay us as much as we'd like, or, only innovators buy. And then we have the whole Everett Rogers bell curve of, we have innovators, early adopters, late adopters, and, laggards at the end. And so the point of that was, how do you manage a business across that? And in fact, actually, if you look back historically, the famous book, Crossing the Chasm, well, Crossing the Chasm was principled on the idea that you have to sell the product, and then you can use the money that you get from the early sales to pay for the next round. Well, what happened in Big Bang Disruption is we found that with what we call near perfect market information, people either want the product or they don't. So there are no more early adopters. So what happens is you fail, and then you succeed wildly, and then you come out of it. And that's the shark fin, and that's what's getting shorter and shorter.
So just let's explain that, because the example you give was an apparel company, Giant Apparel or American Apparel.
American Apparel.
Apparel. And they
American Giant.
American Giants. I knew it was. And they had this sudden hit, and the near perfect information is like a social media post or a website suddenly features you, or an influencer, Kim Kardashian, calls you out.
And so what happened in the example of American Giant, I believe it was Slate.com came out and said that one of their sweatshirts with spangles and, rhinestones and stuff was the best sweatshirt in the world. Well, what happened was they got overnight, from the time that article came out online, they got overnight 500,000 orders. Overnight. And the question is, if you've ever only made 30 or 40 or a couple of hundred of these, 1,000 for different stores, how are you going to make, what eventually became 50,000 and 500,000 orders from around the world? How are you going to capitalize on that? And the reality was that they couldn't. You can't tell people in a fashion business, well, let's wait 6 months until
I got to make them for you.
It's like, I make them for you. Do you mind, waiting 6 months? It doesn't work. And we call this catastrophic success. So we started to live in a world of catastrophic success. Now is a great season to understand that. And Christmas time, right? It's like, well, the stuff that's going to be hot right now and the stuff that's sold out right now is not going to mean anything to children, to adults, even in 3 months, 6 months. And then we can talk a bit more about versioning, if you like, this whole idea of even an iPhone 17, right? Well, where's 18? When's that coming?
I'll just skip this cycle.
Maybe I'll just skip this cycle because I'm a little short on cash right now. And so the whole thing of how it affects the strategy of when technology is fast like that, versioning becomes so important and resale becomes important.
There was an example I was thinking of, apart from American Giant, which was Peloton, for example, or we saw it a lot with the COVID businesses that benefited from the COVID push to an adoption. So Peloton had a huge growth, totally overgrew their capabilities, hired massively, and then all of a sudden that they don't plan on what happens when the pandemic's over, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole thing, and that's where technology can help, and that's where the nature of how you fulfill market demand shifts, is because when you're trying to operate at that sort of speed, and it's one thing to try and get in and out of supply chains, in and out of retail venues at speed, but then there's also the talent curve, which I know you're very excited about. But how do you move in and out of a talent curve, whether it be the short-term sales people, that are selling Pelotons? Do they know the product? Do I have to train these people? How much is it going to cost me to train hundreds or thousands of people in the product, only to find out 6 or 12 months later that I don't really need all those store salespeople, because the floor traffic in the stores has, dropped by 90%. So it really is this question of operating at speed, changing at speed, and doing so in a way that doesn't disappear. That doesn't get you the whole thing that says, well, I'm not even going to bother to try and sell Peloton or whatever it is, because I know that the window is going to be so short that I'm not going to be able to monetize it to make it worth my while. And I think that's a real interesting question that's coming into businesses too, is I think there's probably a lot of innovation, a lot of innovative ideas out there. And nobody really talks about the operational challenge. They talk about the operational challenges of getting things done and organizational pushback and stuff, but they don't really just talk about the nature of, returns and motivation in the short term. It's like, well, is it worth my while?
So that curve, so I am Peloton, my S curve's kind of gone like that. It's also a shark fin. So the one of the ones I thought about the shark fin is, if I see a new technology coming like AI, if I was to follow Everett's bell curve, I go, I have time to build up the capabilities of my organization, see the technology coming, maybe reshuffle my stack to be able to be an AI first company. In the old days, I would have had time to do that. But with the shark fin, the way I kind of see it is, if you see the idea of the shark, and I want to give Paul his gift here now. I got him this, and I'll show this on the screen properly, but this wasn't shot far from here. It's a scene from Jaws where the kid is in Jaws' mouth, and underneath it says, "Stay positive." So,
thank you. I love this so much, because I think it's so true, and we'll talk about it at some point. I mean, the idea of staying positive when you are in the jaws of the shark, catastrophic success, or when you're worse, the victim of a, like in the book Garmin or TomTom, when you're in the jaws of Google navigation. It's like, how do you stay positive? And I think it is interesting. One of the greatest challenges, which was actually put to me, it was a great story. I used to run a chief strategy officer circle. It was one of the best things in my life. It was like 40 different major company chief strategy officers getting together quarterly to discuss their strategy issues. And one of the things I said sort of naively, was talking to one of them, was, how, when you're in big trouble, how do you keep, at it? How do you tell people, let's keep going and stuff? And then he was like, well, Paul, if you don't believe you can win, you don't do it. And I think he was a little appropriately offended. That was sort of like, well, are you saying that I, lie to my people?
Yeah.
Because I was kind of like, well, the big bang's coming. You've seen this. How do you? And so, but I also think, it's probably a nice thing about humans in general, is that we have this optimism and we have this belief that everything, particularly I suppose as Americans, that everything is conquerable, that everything can be, and that, we're going to work our way out of it. Just like this. So when you're in the jaws of the shark, stay positive.
And if that doesn't help, this will help. This is alcohol.
Oh my goodness.
That's an Irish literacy that you supposedly cannot get in the States. So
my goodness.
You can use that for the Christmas cake, maybe.
And I do, yeah. I may apply that directly to, what do they call that? Apply directly to the source or the problem.
Skip the cake. So let's get back. So shark fin. Let's really give it definitive.
That's lovely, thank you.
A pleasure, man. Understanding of that shark fin, because I think that's key, and that will help us leverage then if we go, okay, the shark fin's compressing, but so is the S-curve straightening. That means the nature of how you manage your S-curve totally changes. And and I'll come to this in a second, that's the Easter egg at the end of Big Bang Disruption. But let's start with the shark fin.
There's two things that started. So the one is when we started to understand the shark fin and how do you manage a company differently for that. And basically what we did is we broke it down into 4 segments. There's the kind of before you sell it, the invention, the getting it right. There's the scaling, the rapid scaling, which is the, oops, the market really wants it now. What do we do? And how do you plan for that? Then there's the peak, and the peak hits in saturation. And so there's the bust cycle, essentially. And what most companies a lot of companies haven't experienced is that the nature of rapid saturation, and they don't even really have the thought of it. I worked for a cruise company that never thought of it. They didn't think about a lot of things in terms of who the competitors were. A big screen TV can be a competitor to a cruise, right? And so particularly if you start to get into the world of saturation. But how many cruises should you take in a lifetime? It's like, well, we're so busy selling cruises to mass affluence, the original book, that we don't even want to think about. But yeah, some of our American markets and stuff, we're starting to see some saturation. People don't want to cruise every year, every month, every whatever. And so how do you, cycle that through for people? What do you do? But so this question of how do you innovate? What does it mean to be fail, succeed wildly? How do you partner for that? All things we talk in the book. And then particularly the entropy, which is how do you get out of this now? And I like saying in the book, and I used a time before, was that there's no business so great that it can't be destroyed by messing up by messing up inventory. If you mess up inventory, you mess up all your profits regardless. And so there's a great, example in there where, Microsoft built a slate, computers and they had $1 billion in inventory that had to be marked down because it hadn't been sold and now it was dating. And so your inventory, so that guess of like, well, how many am I going to sell right now? What's the risk I want to take? And then how much profit can I make off of that and not lose it by creating too much and having to sell it at discount and all of that is critical. And then there's the last part, which is the entropy, which is how do I reuse stuff? So that was all of the change in the nature of strategy that we looked at there. And I think what we're getting to is what I call the Easter egg in the conclusion. And we started a next round of thinking that we're like, the books, the book has it all that we can't go into. We can't create another book. That's the next book. In some ways, I hope it to be the next book.
Yeah. This is like the little cliffhanger.
Yeah, but it's really this idea that, well, can you do vertical integration? Now you've got a vertical curve. Can you do vertical integration anymore? Is it even possible? And so we started looking into that. And we started coming to the realization that, it's harder and harder. And many industries are starting to come to that realization.
Yeah.
So in short, what we recognize is that it's not about becoming a supplier with your leftover technologies, your leftover capabilities. So one of the things we said in the book, Big Bang Disruption, and recognize is that, well, you can become a supplier after you have your own products. So you make it, like Texas Instruments or whatever, you make your own stuff, you make your own products, and then you start to become a supplier to someone else. We started to realize, well, no, maybe being a supplier is a good enough strategy on its own. And then taking it to the next level, it's like, well, there's really only 5 roles in this network of managing an S-curve that are really important. And so I'll just go through them quickly for you. The first one is creator, in any order, but it's creators. There are creators. There are people and companies that think up great stuff that people want. So they sort of integrate what the market wants, knowledge of the market, but they integrate that with the second role, which is what we call the inventors. And there are companies that are inventors. They do the pure research. There are assemblers that then make the stuff, and manufacturers that make the things that are assembled in bulk. And I go through that quickly because I want to give an example of the whole thing and how it works. So you take like an iPhone. Apple is the creator. It's like designed in California, made in China, right? Or made in Asia. Hong Kong is what it says right on the box, I believe. So Apple is a creator, and it gains tremendous power in this horizontal integration by the fact that Foxconn, as we all know, is the assembler of this stuff. They work with companies like Corning for Gorilla Glass. Corning invented Gorilla Glass, that hard glass that's on the surface, and manufacturers at bulk chips like Texas Instruments, Samsung, and everything else to have it brought together through Foxconn. Foxconn also handles a lot of the distribution, logistics, and everything else. Now, at the center of all that is the coordinating function. So another role is to be the coordinating function. You can be the supply chain software, you can be the website, you can be the communications provider. Where's AT&T fit in that? Somewhere in this coordination enabling. But really, if you take those 5 roles, you recognize that increasingly, and we've done research on this, increasingly in industries, that's where the focus is becoming, being really, really good in one of those areas, and then enabling a more virtual S-curve from all the different partner suppliers. And how you imagine that and coordinate that and think about strategy in that. Because the interesting thing is that now I've externalized the strategy. It's not just my strategy. I have strategy for how to be a good supplier into this network, but I also have to deeply understand the strategy of the network and the threats to the network. And hopefully I'm in with enough big companies in the big enough network that those become kind of less and less or more and more manageable. But I mean, a quick example sort of is like, well, if I'm a supplier of, gasoline engine parts to an automotive industry that's not effectively prepared, and I'm not effectively prepared for a battery breakthrough, which I don't think we're at yet. We can talk a bit more about how that affects things. But, once there's a real battery breakthrough, we're going to see a dramatic shift. And many of the automakers, we're all sort of, the world isn't unknowing to this, but if you're a supplier, it's really easy to say, well, I got to worry about how to be the best supplier. I don't really have time to worry about where the automotive industry is going and what I'm going to do and what I'm going to make and what I'm going to sell to the next network.
So let's bring it back to something you planted the seed for earlier on, which is the supply chain. The supply chain becomes really important if you're an assembler like an Apple. And I think we talked about this before, the nature of Apple booking up all freight months in advance before Christmas because they know they're going to have a massive sale of Apple phones around Christmas time or whatever it is. They plan for these things well in advance. And it was part of the orchestration of Apple in the first place. But back to your point about the difference between supply chain, we had Yossi Sheffi, MIT professor, one of the world's experts on supply chain before, and he said, the problem with the supply chain is there's tiers in the tiers. So if you go down the tiers of your supply chain, sometimes you don't know where the outsourcing is happening. And what that speaks to me in what you're saying about if I'm managing an S-curve, and that S-curve now used to be vertical integrated, and I used to be able to make my own chips, for example, or say, for example, I was Apple and I made my own hard glass, so the screen didn't crack. But now that's catastrophic success and that business is screwed. I'm left with all this skill set that's no longer needed. But on the flip side, if I've outsourced it all and my companies who supply me are in trouble, and there's tiers in the tiers, I'm in trouble. So my strategy and how I approach strategy has to totally change, because it's not just understanding my strategy, it's understanding the strategy of my collaborators or my partners or my suppliers, but also the longevity of those, because if they go out of business, I'm in trouble.
Exactly. And that's why I think in some ways, which is really interesting and fun, is that being the chief strategy officer, strategy is more interesting and more fun now and more complicated than it's ever been. Because exactly to your point, what happens is if you think of that as sort of that triangle, that pyramid, at the top is the product, and then I've got all these tiers. But what's interesting is I've also got these other triangles in different industries. And so if I'm a down here tier provider, even if I'm the most important and I'm supplying, millions of units of pieces that go up into here, I also have to think about maybe I should be at the bottom of somebody else's pyramid. And who can I knock out there, or one level above or down, so that I get the volume and the scale across the pyramid? So if I'm a chip provider, well, there's chips for AI, there's chips for this and that, but there's also chips for military defense industrial units. There's chips, but still my core competence is in making chips. But each of those industries has a different need, probably, possibly, and so then, well, where do I see the connections as a strategist? And where do I see, the ability to link those so that I can get the scale, and so that, my operating in the defense industry really helps the AI, ops center chips and the chips for that. So you think of like Nvidia, right? It's like you've got to do it across, and then the whole thing of, does Nvidia have suppliers? And it's really fascinating if you look at like Nvidia, and then you use the word before foundry, which I think is a great word, one that we actually used when Intel a number of years ago, came to the foundry insight. It's like, well, because the logic was always, we make chips, sure, and we don't make everything, but we design and make chips. And like, well, what if somebody else designed the chips? And now you get back to the 5 thing, because just to make a small minor correction, you called Apple an assembler, and we would say they're not an assembler; they're a creator. They don't actually build or make anything.
Yeah.
And so it's the same sort of question of Intel and the foundry. It's like, well, do you make the chips? Do you design the chips? And so they have those issues there. I'm even talking to, Intel. It's like, well, should Intel just design chips and outsource it to other makers? Or should they actually concentrate on the capability and having unique global capability in making chips and then make everybody's chips? So you come to us and say, hey, that's a nice design. We can make that for you. And I can tell you that we've spoken about this to lots of different industries. Like, you think of something as basic as soap, right? Detergents, other things. Like, well, should I be in the business of having a lot of research and science in making soaps? And then if I create a detergent, and all of a sudden, what if I invent this detergent that really gets out stains? It's brilliant. Now, do I have to produce that and sell that and create commercials for that for a customer? Or should I just sell that to a soap maker, to a detergent maker? And then the question of, can I find a detergent maker that has the capabilities to make it the way I want it or with the chemicals that I want to use and that? So there is some opportunity. So I don't want to be telling people, give up all of your, vertical integration specialties, your synergies. It's like, there's a lot of synergy to innovating off of certain components, capabilities that and then building the solution out there. Those will remain for a time. But you really have to ask yourself, do I want to put more money into my factories, or do I want to put more money into my innovation? And then it's, if it's in the factories, well, then how am I going to use some money to buy other people's innovations or to bring them in? Because even for Apple to go to Corning and say, the story, if you look in Isaacson's book, the story of Steve Jobs going there and saying, look, I need, something hard. And Corning said, well, we've got this thing in the lab. It's on the shelf. It doesn't really work. It cracks all over the place. And anybody who's owned an iPhone knows how Gorilla Glass used to crack. And, buying insurance against your crack. Yeah. Why? Because it's super, super hard. But if you create the flaw in the crystal structure, it cracks. And then the other thing is when you're making the glass, a lot of it cracks. So there's a lot of waste. So they were like, well, we can make it for you, but you got to buy 1 million units. And that's the only way we're going to be able to pay off figuring out how to manufacture this at scale, because it's not there yet. And so that partnering with innovators, with inventors, from creators. But so we think and we see, and as we look at different stuff, it's like, if you're focused on creation, then how do I get access to all the things that are in the labs? How do I have the people who can appreciate that, who have the energy to go out and find all those things? How do I have the relationships to be able to, like Steve Jobs, to walk and say, well, all right, well, I'm not going to meet a low-level scientist in a coffee shop. I'm going to go straight to the CEO. There's going to be Steve Jobs and the CEO of Corning getting together and saying, hey, this is what we need. This is what you have. Let's put something together.
One of the things there, I was thinking about how with Clayton Christensen, when he wrote The Innovator's Dilemma, it was the source of his work was understanding the disk drive industry. And Kim Clark told him at the time, he said, disk drives are like the fruit fly of industry because the life cycle is so quick. And then I thought about how equally, say with Nvidia, it's the same thing. The life cycle of chips and semiconductors is so quick. The cycle of improvement, say for example, you're saying, I'm skipping iPhone 17 because there's an 18 coming out a month later, or M3 chip, M4 chip in a Mac. I'll just wait for the next cycle, because if it's Moore's law, the increase in performance is so great that I'll just skip a cycle. So I was thinking about those two things. And then I was reading about the Nvidia story. There's a great new book on Nvidia out at the moment, and how Jensen Huang, his whole thing was like, we're always a few months from bankruptcy. And actually, when you look at your frameworks and you go, that is possibly true. So the way NVIDIA dealt with it is they have this mental model of work called hyperspeed. So they work at hyperspeed. But he eventually realized that if I have all my teams working on a chip that is for delivery in 3 months, by the time they build the capability and build that chip and it's delivered to the client, there's also the need for the next cycle of chips. So he had separate teams, and they're almost working on different S-curves at different times. So with your work, I found your work very happy. So in my head there, I can clearly see all these S-curves that if I'm a strategist in an organization, I need to be managing all those S-curves. And they also then affect, like Conway's law, the structure of my organization and the structure of my capability in that organization.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly right. Because what happens is my mind is reeling with a bunch of good things. One is the whole multiple S curves, and that's the whole pivot to the future thing, is perhaps your business has to actually be operating on 3 different generations of disk drives. Or perhaps you have to make the decision that your business is 1 generation of disk drive, and when it's over, it's over. And nobody really does that, which is part of the problem. Everybody spends the profits trying to create the next generation or win in the next cycle, and they burn all the profits from the current cycle. And there's great stories that are old, but going back to my business school days, but the whole thing of like switches, phone switches, and the companies, the name's not at the top of my mind anymore, but the different phone company switches had the same thing. It's like, well, are you going to put in phone company switches that can handle 1,000 people or 1,000 phone numbers versus 10,000 phone numbers? And once I put in phone switches that have 10,000 people, what about the guy who's coming to me with ones that have 1 million switch? So you have this versioning thing. And so as a strategist, it's a really interesting question. And the other question that goes along with the keeping the profits and not losing it to the next investment, the whole milking the cash cow question that we talked about, this capital investment into a generation of technology, or do I wait for the next one, which goes across all strategy? I mean, the question really comes down to what I think is really interesting is the changing in the nature of who accepts risk. Where does the risk reside? Who takes it on? And I'll give you a great example that we got in China and South Korea. A certain South Korea chip maker was building a fab plant, and one of our strategists, chief strategy officers told me, nothing's real until you put $50 billion of steel in the ground. That was a rail company. But it's true, right? It's like when you're trying to decide where to put $50 billion of rail down in a country, you got to get the decision right. Well, the challenge for the South Koreans were, if I'm going to build a $10 billion fab plant, how right do I have to get it? And is this the right technologies, the right capabilities, and the machines and the stuff, the size?
What's a fab plant?
A fabrication plant.
Fabrication
Chip fabrication plant. Yeah. And so if I'm going to have a chip fabrication plant, it's all like the DRAMs, the DRAM, right? And all
gotcha.
things. It's like the disks. It's like if I'm going to build a disk that can do a gigabyte, what about in 5 years when it's a terabyte? And what they realized that, well, they were willing to sell before there was shovels in the ground. They sold off the fab plant at 10 years to a Chinese company. So in 10 years, so the Chinese company said, we'll take that fab plant for you at this price in 10 years, which allowed them to finance the original build because they had a buyer already who was going to buy it for, say 30 cents on the dollar in 10 years. But so this putting together, so when we think about risk management and when we think about investors and how we think about it, for these companies that still have, and there are many, many, many of them, and across even like high tech, there is a capital investment. In many ways, the competition in these scale roles is about, large capital investment. And then the question is, well, who makes the capital investment? Who takes on what level of the risk? And can we now start to create tiers of investors, tiers of time frames? Now, the hotel industry has known this for years. And we see, if you're into it a little bit, you see that hotels get renamed and stuff. It's, well, yeah, because when a hotel ages, a hotel is beautiful, it's built brand new, 10, 20 years later, it starts to, look its age, then you can either sell it to a more down market brand, or you can spend an enormous amount of money, depending on its location, in terms of rehabbing it. But this whole idea of capital asset management across time and across, and then technology, the unknowns of the speed of technology, I think is making for really interesting things going on in the financial markets. That's also worth looking at in terms of strategy, because if you can't get the money, all of strategy, my point, and it's not necessarily mine, is this idea that, and I loved it though, is all of strategy is resource allocation.
Yes.
If you don't change the money, if you don't change who gets how much money, you're not doing anything. You're just talking.
Yeah. Speaking of which, you reminded me when you were talking earlier on about Robert Bergelman, who had on the show, and he studied in depth. He worked alongside Andy Grove, Intel former CEO, may he rest in peace. And so if you think about this, Grove wrote that book, Only the Paranoid Survive. He was a lecturer in MIT. He was extremely well read. And he had Clayton Christensen essentially on the books, working for him, understanding the life cycle of a business. So they make this big decision, again, and the resource allocation, it didn't actually come from the head of the organization. It was a decision made in the middle of the organization. This is what Bob Bergelman was telling us. But the thing I find so interesting about Intel is they made this major transition, this major S-curve jump. But then along comes the opportunity to make the chips for the iPhone, and they can't see a market in it. And they miss the jump. And to your point earlier on, is like, it's kind of almost yesterday we were talking about retirement and pensions. It's like, I have all my company assets. I go, okay, I'm going to invest them in the markets. That could go well, or could go very badly for me. And if I'm using the previous curve's profits to fund the next curve, and I get it wrong, or I miss one, and that one was so profitable for me, sometimes it's so hard to cover. And the reason I share that is, it's no wonder so many CSOs are confused. They're not educated for this new world where these cycles are all changing, and things where you had some advantage in the past. You had what our mutual friend Rita McGrath would call a transient advantage. But to your point yesterday, but I have to be able to take advantage of that transient advantage, otherwise what's the point?
Well, I think that's a great question, because it goes to the first thing I started talking about, which is, what do you want to be when you grow up? What is high performance business? And so, because we also talked about this a little bit, in our coffee conversation, because I think there's a real wisdom in comparison is the thief of joy. There's lots of different words.
We're talking about life there, by the way.
Yeah. But it's true in businesses too. It's like, well, does Intel want to be Nvidia, or does Intel want to be a company that gave its shareholders and its workers hundreds of billions of dollars over this 20 years? And I think that's where a lot of chief strategy officers have to step back to first principles, and why it's so hard to be a chief strategy officer in many ways, because you have to blend all of these different interests. And the story of it was like, well, what do shareholders want? What does the board want? What does the CEO want? What do the employees want? What capabilities do we really have? How deep in a hole are we? What's the likelihood of success? And that's why it's really easy to throw money on a roulette wheel if it's not your money. But that whole question of, and the whole thing is, can you ever be happy? If you win $100 in a casino or $1,000 or whatever, can you ever be happy to just take it and walk away?
Yeah.
Say, not a lot of people win at the casino.
Especially if you have the equivalent of a market looking over your shoulder going, what's the next thing? I mean, you think about Apple now just turned $4 trillion business. Cook is on his way out. They're trying to create the next curve. What is that? People start talking about an Apple car. The market is like constantly, give me more, give me more, give me more. So there's a challenge to just going, we have enough. We're just going to manage the curves we're doing today because of that pressure.
But you have to take it in the context of that and say, well, all right, so, and this is where the pivot to the future comes in, is to say, all right, well, we have history, we have brand value, we have people value, we have these curves in our portfolio. And then we have to say, well, what's the intelligent way of managing these curves? Because the other thing is that it's very hard, unless you really are operating on the new kind of edge of the world network business, it's very hard to have the capability, to have the capital even to start a new business, right? So entrepreneurs can't start new rail. I'm not going to go in and start a new rail line. I'm not going to go in and, almost changing in pharma. I was going to use pharma as an example, but it's getting easier to be a real startup in pharma, and that's part of the risk, right? But there are lots of industries where there's still this capital requirement. And so the question is, how do you finance things? And this was the big question that we looked at for a lot of things. Is like, do you finance it out of these old businesses? And then, in Pivot to the Future, it was really interesting is that for ourselves, even at Accenture, this whole thing of like, well, do you reinvest in the innovation in the old business with the profits because it's still profitable with it's possible? Or how do you steal the money? How do you steal the profits from this business and put it into the next business? And then you're raising the great point of, is should you? And I think the answer to that is so context-based that I would argue that's why you need a great chief strategy officer.
Yeah. But the other thing about your point, you said you had the network of 40 strategists, chief strategy officers, is that you have to be so outward looking now. So you have to, the way you would say an entrepreneur has to get out of the building. As a CSO, you have to almost be living out of the building, understanding the strategy of all those suppliers we talked about, those people who are helping you. The term I was looking for rather than an assembler for Apple is more like an orchestrator. If you're more like an orchestrator,
yes.
You have to understand who plays the instruments.
Yes, exactly. And my take on it is there need to be orchestrators, and I love that term. So I think that's because I think the chief strategy officer in many ways, the CEO is, of course, kind of the chief orchestrator. But unlike where they always say you got to be the conductor of the orchestra inside the company, it's like, there are these unique players that kind of see the whole picture. And we talked about seeing the inevitable future and the kind of nature of jobs. But jobs in some ways was a great example of that. It's like outside, working with all those outside understanding, Glass. How did he know to go to Corning to look for a piece of glass? And having that vision, and we talk about them as visionaries. But I think there's that unique role you need, and it always comes down to people. A good chief strategy officer in the past, and especially now, is really a unique person in the sense that they are able to do exactly what you're saying. They read pervasively and everywhere, and a lot of times it's just the CEO doesn't have time for that, and other people in the company don't have time for that. But yeah, the role of who sees the big picture in all sorts of ways, the inevitable future, who's seeing all the little quiet signals, like they say, the signals on their eyes. And then who also understands what's deeply going on in the company, because you have to integrate that with what assets do I have? What am I working with here? What's easily replicable by a competitor? and what's unique to us and valuable that is never coming back. We give up the formula to Coca-Cola. We give up that brand value. It's not coming back. And it's still valuable, 100 years plus, right, on. So seeing that and managing that, that's why I get excited about, just even from my far-off perspective, but just, gosh, to be in that it's thrilling. I think it's a thrilling job.
And you're speaking to the right audience here, but the problem is so few people actually have the time to read this. For those of you watching us on YouTube, there's a pile of books here, Paul's books on the table. Most of you, I would argue, have a pile of them on your bedside table. I will get through them at some stage, you just tell yourself. It's so difficult with so much information coming at people. And that's the other confusing thing. We have this abundance of, I think Herbert Simon said it, like this abundance of data, but a dearth of attention. In a time where we actually need the attention and the attention span to be able to absorb knowledge. And then if somebody feels like they're on a shark fin curve, and by the time I read that knowledge, it's going to be out of date. But one of the things I find fascinating about doing the show is history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. Like all this information you have given us is, in a way, if you read it, if you understand it, if you apply it, it's applicable now more than ever before. It's just different technologies you're dealing with. And in a way, it's like, when you're a kid and you used to cut out the dolls and then you pull them out, that pieces of paper. It's more like that's your S-curves now. It's not just one. That's your transient advantages. It's not just one, because you have to understand the entire ecosystem. And that's a difficult thing for an organization to do, because, again, back to the point, they haven't been trained for that.
Well, I think that's perfect, and that's, your expertise there, Aidan, because I love when you come up with those things. It's such a great way to think about it. It's like you were cutting, the chief surgeon, we were cutting the paper dolls, we were cutting that person. I can just see that image, and then you pull it out, and it's like, oh my gosh.
It's not just
there's
one.
Not just one for that person. They're all, there's 20 of them, and they're all holding hands because they're all integrated. It's all networked together. So it's the perfect metaphor. I think, when you look at it, everybody only has 24 hours in a day. And so what they talk about, I think, is important, and even in a good CSO, is it's focus and principles. And so what you want to do is simply make sure that you're focused on the right stuff and limit yourself to what you can control, what's important, and be comfortable enough, because you can boil the ocean. I mean, so it's been said, but what I find is a CSO that can avoid boiling the ocean, is worth their weight in salt. And then the other thing is the principles, because again, you say it rhymes, and I think that's true. And so understanding, the principles that you want to be based on. I want longevity over profits. I want, ethical behavior. I want people values, whatever it is. But it's what do you want out of the business? What are the principles? And then what are the principles of how we make money? We make money by adding value. We're generous with our partners. We win together as a whole, inside and outside the company. Those things, it sounds trite and cliche. It's not my usual style, but I really do. And maybe I'm just, maturing into it. But those are the things that are going to help you manage the scale of the problem.
Beautiful, beautiful. Always a huge pleasure. I want to thank the team here in HBS Publishing. So we have in the back Simona, Dave, and Ellie. Thank you to you guys very much. And of course, to our sponsor, Kindle, who's always been with us and driving us to do great things like this, like coming over to Boston and the Harvard Business School. And of course, author of Big Bang Disruption, Jump of the S-Curve, Pivot to the Future, and Mass Affluence, which we will get to the future. Paul, the Shark Fin Nunes.
It was great. It was really fun. Always.
Cheers, man.
Cheers.
Perfect. Mic drop.